So welcome and good afternoon to the Indiana State Board of Accounts Coronavirus Memos and Directives. I'm Mary Fell and I represent Purdue Extension, LaPorte County. And we just want to have a conversation with the Indiana State Board of Accounts, and I will let them go talk about what they are going to discuss. First, we have a few representatives from AIM, AIC, Indiana Library Federation, and we really appreciate their resources and support during this time. We have asked for a little housekeeping, so if you would stop your video, if you are showing a video, and also make sure you are muted. We will have a Q&A afterwards, and I will unmute. If you want to unmute yourself then to ask a question, we can use that, or you can use the chat box. We will try to get done before the governor's talk, and that's at 2:30, I believe. Purdue Extension has a website with cdext.edu, and we have a lot of local government resources regarding the coronavirus, a lot of webinars and resources that you guys might want to look at. And with further ado, I'll introduce Todd Caldwell.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us to discuss some of the accounting issues surrounding the coronavirus and the public health emergency. I know you're all dealing with numerous issues that seem to change by the hour, so we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. We've received numerous inquiries about how to handle certain situations during the public health emergency, and we've issued some memos and one directive from the state examiner that we wanted to discuss with you today. But first, I'll do a little introduction. Again, my name is Todd Caldwell. I'm a Director of Audit Services with the Board of Accounts, specializing in cities and towns, libraries, and special districts. Susan Gordon is also with us, and you'll hear from her in a bit. She also specializes in cities and towns, and libraries, and special districts. We also have listening in Lori Rogers and Ricky Hofer. They're directors as well. They deal with counties mostly, and they'll be available during the question and answers. And I believe the state examiner, Paul Joyce, may be in and out. There's another webinar going on for schools and townships, and I know he was planning on trying to be a part of both. But before we get into any more of the details, I just want to remind everyone that the State Board of Accounts is open for business. We are operational and we're still conducting audits, although they're remotely. And now's a really good time for a remote audit. Your governmental unit may be well suited for one. And we started gravitating toward doing more and more audits remotely. So this has been good for us to see how that operates, and we see a lot of benefits not only on our end but on your end for having a remote audit. So since we're starting that and we're still operational and we're still doing audits, be alert to any notifications you receive about having your audit conducted remotely, and be sure to contact us if you have any questions. We also want to let you know we're available via email and phone. So feel free to write or call depending on the type of unit of government. If you're a city, a town, a library, or a special district, your information is on the left where you can email or call. On the right-hand side, if you're a county, you can shoot an email to that address or call that phone number. There are 5 areas we're going to discuss today. We'll briefly discuss the executive orders issued by the governor and where you can find them. We'll also discuss the memos that were sent out on March the 12th, 16th, 31st, and April the 3rd. State Examiner Directive 2020, which is issued on March the 19th. We'll go over some state resources from the Office of the Public Access Counselor and the Department of Local Government Finance, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. In case you haven't had a chance to read the governor's executive orders, they can be found at this link, in.gov/gov/2384.htm. We also have links on our website, the Board of Accounts website, and I'll show you where those are in a minute. One item that we wanted to point out and that we get a lot of questions about is having a public meeting and how to handle that. In Executive Order 20-09, the governor suspends some requirements of the open door law. Previously, if a meeting was to be held electronically, the unit had to adopt a policy for electronic participation. That requirement is suspended during the public health emergency. Also suspended is the requirement that one member of the governing body be physically present. So during the public health emergency, you can have a public meeting of your governing body by video conference or telephone conference, as long as a quorum of members participates and meetings are made available to the public and media. So we've heard from a lot of different units that are streaming live on Facebook, maybe a YouTube channel, through Skype or through Zoom or even Google Chats. So any of those are available as far as a video type of conference. As I mentioned, we've sent out a few memos in the past couple of weeks. If you didn't get them for some reason, or you need to refer to them more quickly than trying to find your copy, they're available on our website, on our homepage. So depending on your screen size, once you get there, you may need to scroll down a bit to see the section on SBOA information on coronavirus. There are links to the memos that we're going to talk about and the state examiner directive regarding the coronavirus at this location. And there's some other links if you scroll down a little further for those other agencies that we'll discuss before we're done. So with the memos, the March the 12th memo has a few things that we wanted to specifically touch on. First, with all things that might require changes or alterations to your existing statutes or local policies, you want to be sure to consult with your attorney. We urge governing bodies to work with their attorneys to develop a policy or policies specific to the public health emergency. Policies developed should have broad language that can reference more specific materials so that the policy doesn't need to be constantly updated and reapproved. Circumstances are changing so fast that if you make your policies specific and then changes are necessary, you'll need to amend and reapprove. So make your language broad enough that you don't have to take the time to do that. And the policy would need to be adopted through the normal processes as provided by statute, including approved in a public meeting. I know many communities have canceled all meetings altogether, but you want to keep in mind that Indiana Code 5-14-1.5-5 and then the letter D as in dog does provide for conducting emergency meetings if necessary. In the event of an emergency meeting, the time requirements for posting notice don't apply, so that 48-hour requirement doesn't apply. You do, though, have to give the media that has requested notice of your meetings the same notice that is given to members of the board, of your governing board, when they are notified. And you want to also keep in mind, as you're developing these policies, any collective bargaining agreements that you might have, so any actions that your board and governing bodies take could impact the provisions in those contracts. Finally, we want you to know that the Board of Accounts will not take audit exception to these policies and the resulting responses that are due to the coronavirus. I want to explain what that term audit exception means, because I know we have some new officials in the audience that might not know, or maybe they've heard that term and not real sure what it meant. I had a library director call me a couple of weeks ago and ask that question, so I wanted to let them know that when we're doing an audit, if we find something that you're not doing that you're supposed to do, or you did something you weren't supposed to do, maybe it's not complying with a statute in the Indiana Code, or you're not complying with an accounting guideline that's from our manuals that we've put out. We call that an exception. We've taken exception to something that you did or didn't do, and then depending on the significance of that exception, it could elevate to where it's a matter that we report as a written comment in our audit report. So to not take audit exception means we won't take exception to what you've done, and we would not have a comment in our report. And we concluded, she concluded that the library director did by saying, so exception equals bad and no exception equals good. And I said, yep, that's a perfect way to think of it if that helps you do it. And so that's the way she went with it. But you'll hear us refer to audit exception a lot, not only in this discussion, but throughout our correspondence. The second memo went out on March the 16th. In it, we provide several suggestions and items to consider. The first thing to know is that our guidance should not be considered restrictive. Governmental bodies will need to monitor and address situations as quickly as possible. Things are very fluid and changing very quickly. And your boards or councils and other governing bodies will need to be flexible in their approach. Remember, the situations and issues being faced are temporary, although we don't have a real good feel for when we won't be in emergency conditions any longer. We know that someday that they'll be over with. So try to be as flexible as you can before we have to return to life as we knew it prior to the pandemic. The policies and actions adopted should be in writing and designed to maintain operations as close to normal as possible, and with the well-being of employees and the public in mind. I know normal seems like a long time ago, but boards still need to govern, and there still has to be structured leadership from elected and appointed officials and governing bodies. The March 16th memo contains some items to consider. Most questions we received initially surrounded payroll. Our recommendation is to check out any guidance provided by the Department of Labor. The Department of Labor has recommended a review of leave policies and for employers to have increased flexibility. There are a couple of good websites that you might want to consider visiting. The first one is dol.gov/coronavirus. The other one is dol.gov/agencies/WHD/pandemic. Also with payroll, and many of you may already be doing this, is determining what work can be done remotely, most often from the employee's home. Also a determination of what has to be conducted at a government location, because there are some things that just can't be done from an employee's home. Consider how employees will be paid in the event of a mandatory closing of an office or building, or if someone has to be quarantined or isolated and can't do their job from home. We're going to discuss that aspect in a few minutes. You could consider trade-off days. Perhaps some essential employees work a day in the office while others are working at home, and then they switch. That could aid in getting tasks that have to be completed in an office setting while providing space to socially distance themselves from others. Establish who makes the decision at your unit on who works from home. It could be a mayor, a library director, a commissioner, a department head, council, or board. And don't forget about security. With people working at home and taking things off-site, what measures will you take to protect accounting records, computerized records, laptops, monitors, printers, and any other assets? What if an employee can't do their job from home? You need to consider how or if to pay that employee. Please know that the Board of Accounts will not take exception to the extension of paid leave time that is in accordance with allowable, approved policies, actions, and provisions. Our memo on the continuity of operations that I'll go over in a minute will discuss that further. And finally, be sure to keep good records of your costs. The more that you track COVID-19 expenses, the better chance you'll have of getting state or federal reimbursement in the future. It's possible if you have costs that you can't support, you may not get as much reimbursed. So if you're paying someone who's not working, that's a cost to you. If you have to go out and buy laptops or computer or monitors or printers for people to work offsite, those are costs that might be reimbursable in the future. So anything that can be coronavirus related, make sure you document it well in case you need it down the road for reimbursements. The March 31st memo was a result of inquiries from local governments regarding the use or using public funds to assist in some fashion local businesses or citizens who have been negatively impacted by the coronavirus. Some of the funds we were asked about have specific statutory uses, which don't include easing someone's economic burden. So we recognize that during the public health emergency, a broader reading of the statutory uses of public funds is permissible. I've alluded to the next memo a couple of slides ago. The April 3rd memo was developed to assist units with developing a plan to continue essential operations in the event key personnel were not only unable to work at an office or remotely, but in the event they should become totally incapacitated for an extended period of time. We know of one governmental unit where the fiscal officer became ill to the point of not being able to even work remotely. The only other person in this business office was unable to come in because of the fear the office was contaminated. So in this case, officials had to look at how to operate when the only person able to process transactions and write checks was not physically going to be able to do so for an undetermined period of time. The memo recommends developing a plan for prolonged and substantial absenteeism by employees, including key business or accounting functions. There may be, as an example, I mentioned an office where there are only one or two people involved in the accounting function. So how are you going to handle if both of those people become ill? That's what a plan developed now will help with in the event that they do get sick. You want to include in the plan designated who would take over and how. You want to work now with your banks in case the person on the checking account is the only one, and look at ways that how are checks going to be issued. You want to consider having a central location for important contact information, names of the governing board members, contacts at your banks, with your accounting software vendors. If you have one person that you go to, if you have accounting or computer issues, having that name somewhere, maybe even some neighboring units around other libraries, other cities, other towns near you that might be able to provide some assistance during the absence. Also a list of items that could be postponed until after the emergency. And equipment, what would be available to permit employees to work remotely. To help in the development of your plan, and in addition to the items we note in the memo, the Federal Emergency Management Agency has a continuity resource kit on their website that we found to be very useful. We recommend that you check it out. The website is listed on the memo, or you can simply Google FEMA Continuity Resource Toolkit. You know, the screen says just kit, but I found it easier, or it came right up when I Google searched, used the word toolkit in there. So FEMA Continuity Resource Toolkit. So to conclude the discussion on the memos before I turn it over to Susan, officials should keep monitoring their specific situations. Things are changing as we speak, so it's to your advantage to keep on top of things and make changes as necessary. You want to work with your attorneys. Remember, what we've discussed in our memos are our audit positions and should not be construed as legal opinions. So get written opinions from your attorney whenever possible. And document. You know, as auditors, we love to have as much written documentation as you can throw at us. And for my time in the field, it literally was thrown at us. So make sure the intent, the actions, and policies of governing bodies are in writing and as clear as possible. That'll help us both down the road come audit time. Now I'd like to introduce and turn things over to Susan Gordon, a Director of Audit Services who also specializes in cities, towns, libraries, and special districts, to discuss State Examiner Directive 2020-1.
Hi everybody, this is Susan. Two of the most common questions we've received in the office relate to the timely deposit of funds and the approval of claims, and how all of that is supposed to work during this public health emergency. Because of this, the state examiner issued Directive 2020-1 to give some options to you on how to handle those procedures during the emergency. And so let's go ahead and just go over those provisions now. All of you know that Indiana Code 5-13-6-1 requires funds to be deposited within the next business day once that total reaches $500. That law is still in effect, but during this period of public health emergency, the State Board of Accounts will not take audit exception if the governing body approves the frequency for deposit of public funds to be limited to no less than 2 times per week. And this position has been confirmed in a governor's executive order as well. There are a few specific items that you need to be addressed in your policy. First, the governing body should specifically state that the frequency of deposits may be limited to 2 times per week. The directive states that deposits must be made on Tuesday and Thursday so as to limit the amount of cash on hand in your office. However, the governor's executive order, which came out after the directive, does not have this stipulation. While it's advisable to make deposits on Tuesday and Thursday, we are not going to take audit exception to other specified days of deposit as long as the deposits are made no less than twice per week. Second, on those days when a deposit is not made, the cash on hand should be secured in a safe. If you don't have a safe, then you can use a locked cabinet or a locked office, but you will need to weigh the amount of security you have available with the amount of money that you'll have on hand and how much risk that you're going to be comfortable with. Having these processes documented and in place will allow your unit to maintain structure and order during this emergency. Indiana Code 5-11-10-1.6 governs the approval of claims, including the required approval of the governing body, and that law is still in effect. However, during this public health emergency, we are not going to take audit exception if the governing body chooses to use one of the following procedures. First, the governing body may designate one of its members to approve claims for payment in advance of board allowance. You will need to document how this is going to be accomplished. For example, in this time of quarantine and social distancing, the governing body may authorize the fiscal officer to electronically send a list of claims to a board member for approval, and that approval would be documented through a return email to the fiscal officer. Any claims which are not approved would be separately listed in the return email. If this procedure is adopted, the board must allow those claims at its first meeting after the public health emergency has been lifted. Secondly, cities and towns and libraries do have statutory authority to adopt an ordinance or resolution for the pre-approved payment of claims. Normally, this would be done by ordinance for cities and towns or by resolution for libraries. However, if the governing body provides written approval to the fiscal officer to pay certain claims during the public health emergency, we will not take audit exception. Again, the board must allow those claims at its first meeting after the emergency has ended. You can use both of these points in conjunction with one another. For example, the governing body may authorize that certain claims may be paid by the fiscal officer during the public health emergency, but any claims that are not specified would be pre-approved by the designated governing board member. Even though we are in a state of emergency, it is important to have controls in place to safeguard the use of public funds. These processes will allow your unit to maintain that structure and order. This is a screenshot of additional information that is available on our website at in.gov/SBOA. As Todd said earlier, we have the executive orders posted there too. You can see here that the Department of Local Government Finance and the Office of the Public Access Counselor have provided a lot of useful information that pertains to their respective areas. So please be sure to check these out. For example, if you would like to know how public hearings are affected, you can look at the memo from DLGF dated March 30th of 20. The Public Access Counselor has put together a number of frequently asked questions on how the open door law and access to public records laws has been impacted as well. The DLGF website address is in.gov/DLGF. The Public Access Counselor website is in.gov/PAC. Now, one other thing that we wanted to point out, it is expected that the state examiner will be issuing another memorandum today or tomorrow regarding temporary transfers if you have cash flow problems. So be looking for that. We hope that all of this is helpful to you as you work to provide service during this unprecedented time. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Todd now for some closing remarks before question and answers.
Thanks, Susan. I just want to again thank everyone for taking the time to join us today for this webinar. I want to leave you with our contact information on the last slide. My name and Susan's name, and if you're a city or a town or a library or a special district, you can email those respective email addresses or call the number 317-232-2513. If you're a county, you can email counties@sboa.in.gov or call 317-232-2512, and you can speak to Lori Rogers or Ricky Hofer. They'll be glad to help you or assist in any way that they can. And with that, I think we're ready for the questions that came in during the presentation. Mary, are you able to read those to us?
Yeah, and Paul has been answering some of the questions in the chat, but the first one that Paul answered was, if the council has not approved the 2 days per week deposit and there is no cash, only checks, does the deposit still need to be made daily if over $500?
And yeah, you can see that the state examiner, Paul Joyce, answered yes to that question.
Another one was, the deposits only have to happen if getting money in, right? Since we are closed, no cash or checks coming in.
Yes, that is correct. If you don't have any cash or no one's there opening checks, and if the office is shut down to that point, then you wouldn't have to do twice a week. Let's say, for example, if you're in an office where someone is coming in once a week, maybe to check the mail, and maybe there's perhaps a check that's found, then that's when you would want to issue the receipt and consider making that deposit. But yeah, if you're an office, if you're a library that's completely shut down, for example, and no one's coming in paying any fines or making any copies or doing anything like that, then you obviously wouldn't have anything to deposit those on Tuesdays or Thursdays.
Okay, we had a comment saying the only money we have coming in except for direct deposits is at their summer reading program donations. We had another comment, the only change we have made is close the building to the public. They are still able to pick up applications in the entrance hallway and complete an online application. The office is still open for phone calls. Do we still have to adopt a resolution?
Yes, I think it would be in the best interest of everyone at that unit if you would do that. You want to have policies and procedures in place for depositing money, or how things are going to happen, how bills are going to get paid. Even though your office is closed, you might still have bills coming in that need to be paid, and somebody may need to write those checks. So we would encourage all units to develop the policy that we mentioned in the very first memo, and set up your procedures and your controls so that you can still have operations to some degree.
Okay, we are waiving the late fees on utility bills, but our council, with support from our attorney, approved a resolution allowing utility bill relief for small businesses for February, March, and April if they apply and reviewing committee approvals. Will they take exception to this?
I was reading through the question again. We would have to look at the resolution. I think you mentioned in the question with the support of our attorney, we would definitely want to see that in writing. And the memo from March the 31st talks about specifics of what we would expect. That governing body adopt a policy in a public meeting that approves expenditures and authorized use of funds, and that you've got the written advice of counsel with the explanation that how funds are being used or not being used would address the economic effects of the public health emergency.
So we had our policy calls for a deposit once a week if total weekly deposit is less than $500. The one comment to the adopt a resolution, he or she wanted to know, he or she is still unclear. The office is still open as usual. The public is just not allowed inside the office. So do they still need that resolution?
We would recommend that they have something in place if the office is still open and somebody has the coronavirus and maybe is asymptomatic, but gives it to everybody else, and they all have to close at once, that wouldn't be the time to maybe have to put something in place. So we would very much encourage you to make those plans, make those policies now.
Another question is, could economic development funds be used to provide local business relief if approved by governing body?
The assistance to others was discussed in the March 31st, 2020 memorandum from the state examiner. And there are some provisions in there that need to be followed. For example, the emergency order still needs to be in effect. The governing body has to adopt a policy in a public meeting that approves the expenditures as an authorized use of public funds. The governing body should also receive written advice of counsel that this expenditure has a legitimate government purpose and is acceptable under the Indiana Code during the emergency declaration. So we would encourage you to go back and read that memorandum in its entirety.
And then I have, is there a place where we may go to get an idea on what documentation for employee hours/timekeeping when deemed work at home employees?
You might check on the Department of Labor website and those couple of links that I mentioned earlier. I don't know that we've had anything that we have issued. I think we would expect it to be similar to what you normally do for employees, with some kind of notation or indication of that person was working remotely. And then you would need to have some controls in place, or should consider some controls to ensure that the person really is at home doing their job, whether if they produce reports on a frequent basis, either daily or weekly or something. Of course, you would expect those reports to still be generated. Just something that's going to be different at every place on what you can do to ensure that person is working. For myself, for example, I know we have video chats with my supervisor and documentation that I'm doing stuff. I'm copying people on emails so they see that kind of thing. But I don't know of a specific place to get a better idea then maybe those things are checking out the Department of Labor's website on it. Susan, do you have anything that you could add to that?
No, I don't. I think the Department of Labor would be a great source of information for that.
Because I'm sure they probably had that question or something similar, so they may have something on their website.
There is one last question I see, and keep the questions coming in the chat if you would like. This question was, who needs to adopt the policies of 2 deposits per week? Would this be the commissioners or the county council?
I don't know if Lori or Ricky are still with us or if they have unmuted their microphones as our county directors.
Wait, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear
Sorry,
you now.
I was trying to figure out how to unmute. I
Oh.
apologize. This would be for your commissioners. Your county commissioners should determine whatever policy it is, and make the 2 days deposit.
Thank you. And I think this is maybe another one. If we adopt a policy that pays employees while we are closed, even when they cannot work from home, is this okay? Do we need to specifically grant leave?
If you're going to adopt a policy, then yes, that would not be something we take exception to. It would depend on, we would want to, during an audit, see the policy and that it was approved in a public meeting. But basically that would be something we would not take exception to if you'd followed all the provisions of the memos and the state examiner directives to this point.
Are there any other questions? And you could unmute yourself too if you would like to talk to them instead of type. I'll give another minute for any other questions, and then I'll have Todd and Susan wrap it up, or if they have any other thoughts. Okay, we have a township question. Is there an exception to pay the internet for a family that has children that has to use it for school?
Well, that's a great question. I think if you wanted to include that in your policy that was adopted, that the township was okay with doing that, and it was approved in a public meeting like we've talked about, I don't see that we would take audit exception to that.
Thank you, Todd. And an executive order from the mayor created a pandemic leave policy. Does this have to be approved by the BOW at their next meeting?
For it, are you there?
Yes, Paul, we can hear you.
For this to be effective, the mayor can't order the policy. It has to be approved by the governing board. They're the only ones who can set policy. for this. The mayor can make a recommendation to them for it. They're the ones that have to allow it. So the proper procedure would be for them to set it before people go take off for it with it. And that would be through the procedures that was established to adopt a policy by the governing body, which is not the mayor. Does that answer that question?
And it looks like there was another response. Additionally, this order was signed by all members of BOW, just hasn't been presented in public meeting.
It needs to be brought up in a public meeting. Now, that public meeting can be, not the normal public meeting, but they can have a virtual one and adopt that policy. We still have to make sure that we stay being transparent to the public. That's extremely important.
Thank you, Paula. And the response was, that answers the question.
Thank you.
No problem. And then I have another one. Is there a maximum number of months for which employees may be paid while not working during the pandemic?
I think that would go back to your policy that it was adopted, and assuming they don't set a certain number of months in that policy, our position would be that once the public health emergency was over would be when that would stop. So since no one knows when that's going to be, I think the answer to the question, is there a maximum number of months, is no, because a lot of it is still unknown. But it could depend on the policy. If you adopted a policy that said for the next 3 months, we're going to do this, and the public health emergency existed for those 3 months, I don't see that would be an audit exception that we would take. I don't know if Susan or anybody else has anything to add to that.
No, I think that was perfect. Thanks.
I don't have any other questions, so if...
Okay, well then I want to thank everybody again for their time and participation, and hope everybody stays safe. Mary, if you have any closing remarks, you can do those now.
Well, I just want to thank you guys for being on the webinar. I have recorded this webinar, so hopefully we'll be able to get it up to send out by Friday. And thank you guys to the State Board of Accounts for having this webinar.
Thank you.